A murder, a life sentence, and the only proof was a frozen pizza roll. Prosecutors in Kansas told a jury the bite marks on that snack were the signature of a killer. It was enough to send a man to prison for life. But the science was rotten. The evidence? Junk. 6 years stolen from one man. A grieving family betrayed. And the real killer still out there. This is the story of Tyler Vogel and the broken system that proved just how easy it is to convict the innocent. Watch to the end. Subscribe now, because the truth they tried to bury starts here. The house sat quietly on North 5th Street in Leavenworth, Kansas. It was February of 2018, a frigid Midwestern winter. The trees were bare, the sidewalks crusted with snow, and in that kind of cold, sound travels differently, sharper somehow. Neighbors remember the day mostly for its stillness, broken later by the crackle of police radios and the slow arrival of yellow crime scene tape. Inside that house, officers discovered the body of 71-year-old Robert Elmore Jr. He was well known in the community, a lifelong Leavenworth resident who'd lived a modest, quiet life. His death was brutal, unexpected, and unsettling. Robert wasn't the kind of man who made enemies. He wasn't the type you'd imagine in the middle of a homicide investigation. But the crime scene told a different story. The home was in disarray, signs of a struggle, an elderly man who had fought back with what strength he could summon. And in the chaos of overturned furniture and scattered belongings, detectives found something strange. Something they hadn't expected at all. A single, half-eaten, frozen TGI Fridays pizza roll. At first, it barely registered. An odd detail, yes, but in a home where many small items were out of place, it could have been nothing. Still, one detective bagged it, logging it as evidence. That pizza roll, no larger than a coin, would become the centerpiece of one of the most bizarre criminal cases Kansas had ever seen. It's worth pausing here, because this is the paradox at the heart of the story. A man's freedom, his very life, would eventually be determined by a frozen snack food. That pizza roll would lead to a murder conviction. Years later, it would unravel in a courtroom, exposed as the product of junk science. But on that day in 2018, it was simply a clue, small and strange, sitting among the wreckage of Robert Elmore's final moments. To understand the weight of what happened, we need to know Robert himself. Elmore had lived in Leavenworth most of his 71 years. Friends described him as dependable, steady, and frugal. He'd worked jobs that weren't glamorous, but they were honest. He was a veteran, a neighbor, a man who carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd lived through both hardship and stability. Robert lived alone, though he kept in touch with relatives. He wasn't isolated, but he wasn't constantly surrounded by family either. That independence made the discovery of his body all the more devastating. No one had expected him to become the victim of violence in his own home. The Leavenworth community was shaken. Leavenworth is a town people often associate with its prison. Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary is among the most famous in America. But outside the walls of the prison, the city has the feel of any small Midwestern town. A place where people know each other, where crime happens but rarely at this level of brutality. So when police announced Robert Elmore's death and classified it as a homicide, the shockwaves spread quickly. Police began canvassing the area, looking for anyone who might have heard or seen something. A forced entry seemed unlikely. The house wasn't obviously broken into. That suggested Robert may have known his attacker, or at least let them inside willingly. Detectives cataloged everything: The state of the rooms, fingerprints, DNA swabs, fibers. But again and again, they came back to that pizza roll. It wasn't just half-eaten. It appeared to have been bitten into, then discarded, almost carelessly. Forensic testing revealed something unusual, a bite mark. Embedded in the soft, frozen dough of the pizza roll was the imprint of human teeth. Investigators believed it could be matched to a suspect. That was the theory. That was the key. Enter Tyler Vogel. At the time of the crime, Vogel was in his late 30s. He wasn't a stranger to the law. He'd had run-ins, brushes with criminal charges, but nothing of this magnitude. Vogel lived in Leavenworth, not far from Robert Elmore. The two were not close, but their paths had crossed. Tyler Vogel was, depending on whom you asked, either troubled or misunderstood. Some remembered him as a restless young man who never quite found his footing. Others described him as dangerous, someone you wouldn't want to cross. When detectives began circling possible suspects, Vogel's name rose to the top. There were rumors, whispers of conflict between Vogel and Elmore. And most importantly, investigators were convinced they could prove his connection scientifically by linking his teeth to the bite mark on that pizza roll. This was not the first time bite mark evidence had been used in American courts. For decades, forensic dentists, sometimes called odontologists, had testified that human dentition was unique enough to identify individuals with certainty. The logic was simple. Just as no two fingerprints are alike, no two bite patterns are either. But that logic, as we'll learn, was flawed, deeply flawed. Still, in 2018, in Leavenworth, Kansas, it felt like a breakthrough. The pizza roll wasn't just a snack left behind. It was a signature, a fingerprint of sorts, and police were convinced it pointed straight at Tyler Vogel. When police arrested Vogel, the story spread quickly in local headlines. Man arrested in murder of 71-year-old. Beneath the shock of the crime itself was an odd detail reporters couldn't resist highlighting: the pizza roll. How often does a frozen snack become evidence in a murder trial? The arrest painted Vogel as reckless, careless. Who, after all, would commit murder and then stop to eat? Prosecutors leaned into this narrative, suggesting it showed both Vogel's arrogance and his impulse-driven nature. A man who thought he could get away with anything. Vogel, for his part, denied involvement. He maintained he hadn't killed Robert Elmore. He insisted the pizza roll meant nothing. But the machinery of prosecution was already moving forward, and it was powered by the bite mark found in that dough. The stage was set for a dramatic trial. On one side, prosecutors convinced they had the smoking gun, or rather, the smoking pizza roll. On the other, a defense team skeptical of the science, but up against decades of precedent in which courts had accepted similar testimony. And hanging over it all, the memory of Robert Elmore, a man who'd lived quietly and died violently, his community demanding answers. When police first arrested Tyler Vogel, the case appeared straightforward, even airtight. Investigators had a homicide victim, a community demanding justice, and what they believed was physical evidence that spoke louder than words. That evidence was small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. A half-eaten, frozen TGI Fridays pizza roll. The prosecution's story seemed compelling. Vogel had been inside Robert Elmore's home. He had attacked the 71-year-old, and in a careless, almost taunting move, he had bitten into a pizza roll while committing or fleeing the crime. He left behind the mark of his own teeth, a signature of guilt. For detectives and prosecutors, it was the kind of evidence they believed jurors would understand immediately. You didn't need a law degree to look at an imprint of teeth. You didn't need a background in science to be swayed by side-by-side comparisons of dental molds. Jurors could see it with their own eyes. It felt clear. But clarity is not the same as truth. In the months after the crime, investigators worked methodically to build their case against Vogel. They gathered his background, his record, and most importantly, his dental impressions. A forensic odontologist, a dentist trained in analyzing bite marks, was called in to compare Vogel's teeth to the impression left on the pizza roll. The dentist's conclusion: the bite mark was consistent with Vogel's dentition. That phrase, consistent with, would become the backbone of the prosecution's case. The dentist was confident, almost unwavering. He told investigators that the unique shape, spacing, and alignment of Vogel's teeth matched what had been imprinted into the soft dough. For prosecutors, this was the eureka moment. They had motive, they had opportunity, and now they had science. To understand why this felt convincing, we have to step back. For much of the 20th century, American courts embraced forensic techniques that today would never pass scientific scrutiny. Bite mark analysis was one of them. It began appearing in U.S. trials in the 1970s and quickly gained credibility. Dentists testified with absolute certainty, claiming they could identify suspects based on the marks their teeth left on skin, food, or other malleable surfaces. The logic seemed intuitive. Teeth are unique, just like fingerprints. If a clear impression was left behind, surely it could be matched to the person who made it. The problem is that human skin, and in this case, food, is not a reliable medium for recording such detail. Skin stretches, dough compresses, angles distort, lighting changes the way marks appear in photographs. By the early 2000s, studies began dismantling the credibility of bite mark analysis. The National Academy of Sciences, in a landmark 2009 report, stated plainly that there was no scientific basis for claiming bite mark identifications were reliable. The Innocence Project later reported that at least 26 wrongful convictions had been linked to bite mark evidence. In other words, the very science being used to convict people was increasingly recognized as junk. But in 2018, in Leavenworth County, Kansas, that skepticism had not fully permeated. Courts were still allowing odontologists to testify. Jurors were still persuaded. And Tyler Vogel would soon become one of the last, and perhaps most notorious, defendants to feel the weight of that discredited science. When Vogel's trial opened, prosecutors painted him as a man of volatility and violence. They suggested he had targeted Robert Elmore during a burglary, possibly fueled by desperation or impulse. The centerpiece of their narrative was the pizza roll. They projected images of the bite mark for jurors. They called their forensic dentist to the stand. Jurors heard phrases like reasonable degree of dental certainty and consistent with Vogel's teeth. The dentist explained the points of comparison, the arch, the spacing, the rotations of certain incisors. He told jurors that the bite was not just similar, but uniquely aligned with Vogel's dentition. To the prosecution, this wasn't coincidence. This was proof. Vogel's defense team had little room to maneuver. Challenging bite mark evidence in 2018 was still uphill work. Yes, national reports had questioned its validity. Yes, experts had begun discrediting it. But judges still allowed it in, and many jurors still believed it. The defense argued that the pizza roll was an unreliable medium. It was partially frozen, then thawed. The bite had distorted over time. Any claim of precision, they argued, was more art than science. They reminded the jury of something critical. Consistent with does not mean is. But against the weight of a confident expert, those arguments often landed weakly. The defense also pointed out that no direct DNA linked Vogel to the crime. No fingerprints were conclusively his. No eyewitness had placed him inside Robert Elmore's home at the time of the murder. But the prosecution didn't need those things. They had the bite mark. They had a story that seemed to make sense. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. On one side sat Vogel, flanked by his attorneys, maintaining his innocence. On the other, Robert Elmore's family, grieving and determined to see justice served. Community members filled the benches. For many, Vogel already looked guilty. The very fact that police had arrested him, that prosecutors had put him on trial, seemed to confirm it. The pizza roll became almost a character in the trial. Jurors leaned forward when it was displayed. They studied the images. Some even nodded when the odontologist explained his analysis. For jurors, this wasn't abstract science. It was tangible, visible, right there in front of them. After deliberations, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The words landed heavily. Vogel's face was described as stunned, though stoic. His attorneys immediately vowed to appeal, but in that moment, Vogel was no longer just a suspect. He was a convicted murderer. The sentence was severe, life in prison. For Robert Elmore's family, there was closure. A killer had been brought to justice. For the community, there was relief. And for prosecutors, there was vindication. But for Tyler Vogel, it was the beginning of what would become a years-long fight to overturn what he believed was a conviction built on nothing more than junk science. In hindsight, the trial reads almost like a cautionary tale. Jurors were swayed by evidence that looked scientific but was not. A man's future was sealed not by DNA, not by fingerprints, not by eyewitness testimony, but by a frozen snack food. Vogel entered prison as inmate number, redacted for narration, serving a life sentence. And outside, the debate over forensic bite marks grew louder. National organizations were calling for the outright ban of such evidence in courtrooms. The American Board of Forensic Odontology itself, once the certifying body for bite mark analysts, admitted in 2016 that the discipline had major limitations. But for Vogel, that was little comfort. His reality was a prison cell. Even before the trial ended, Vogel's defense team had planted the seeds of an appeal. They argued that the bite mark evidence should never have been admitted. They argued it was unreliable, prejudicial, and unsupported by real science. At the time, those arguments failed. The trial judge allowed the testimony. The jury believed it. But in the years that followed, those same arguments would resurface, this time in a higher courtroom, before a judge willing to listen. When the gavel fell in that Leavenworth County courtroom in 2019, Tyler Vogel's life seemed effectively over. The jury had spoken. The judge had imposed the harshest possible sentence, life in prison. For most people in the community, the case was closed. The narrative was tidy. Robert Elmore's killer was behind bars. The peculiar pizza roll had given up its secret. Justice, they believed, had been served. But for Vogel and his defense attorneys, the story was only beginning. Because even as he was led away in shackles, they were already preparing for the long, grueling battle of an appeal. Prison life settled over Vogel like a suffocating blanket. Inmates who enter with a murder label are rarely treated kindly by others. He endured suspicion, hostility, and the endless grind of institutional time. Yet behind the scenes, his attorneys were combing through every transcript, every exhibit, every line of expert testimony. They knew there had been cracks in the case from the start. They just needed the right court and the right judge to see them. The appeal began in the Kansas appellate courts. The defense argued that the trial had been tainted by unreliable forensic evidence. They challenged the admission of bite mark testimony, describing it as prejudicial and scientifically baseless. But early appeals moved slowly, bogged down in legal procedure. It wasn't until post-conviction relief motions, those filed after direct appeals had failed, that Vogel's case truly began to gain traction. By then, the national conversation around forensic evidence had shifted dramatically. Reports, studies, and court rulings across the country were exposing the dangers of bite mark analysis. The legal tide was turning. The decisive moment came when Vogel's case landed in the courtroom of Judge Gunnar Sundell, a district judge known for his meticulous reasoning and willingness to challenge shaky precedents. In February 2024, Sundell was asked to decide whether Vogel's conviction could stand. The hearing was not a retrial. It wasn't about guilt or innocence in the broad sense. It was about whether the conviction itself was legally sound, and that depended on whether the jury had been swayed by evidence that never should have been admitted in the first place. Judge Sundell's written opinion stretched dozens of pages. In it, he dissected the bite mark evidence piece by piece. He began by acknowledging the prosecution's reliance on the pizza roll. The odontologist's testimony, Sundell noted, had been presented with authority. Jurors had been told that Vogel's teeth were consistent with the bite. That language, Sundell wrote, carried enormous weight in the minds of laypeople. But then he turned to the scientific record. He cited studies, national reports, and prior cases. He emphasized the 2009 National Academy of Sciences report, which found no scientific support for bite mark identifications. He pointed to statements from the Innocence Project and even from the American Board of Forensic Odontology itself, which had admitted serious flaws in the field. Sundell's conclusion was stark. The bite mark evidence in Vogel's case was junk science. He wrote that the pizza roll, as a medium, was inherently unreliable. The surface could compress, distort, or degrade. The supposed match between Vogel's teeth and the impression was no more than speculation dressed in the language of science. And then came the most damning line of his decision. Without the bite mark evidence, no reasonable jury would have found Tyler Vogel guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. With those words, Judge Sundell vacated Vogel's conviction. He did not declare Vogel innocent. He did not close the case, but he nullified the verdict that had put him behind bars. The ruling sent shockwaves through Leavenworth County. For the victim's family, it was a gut punch. They had believed they had closure. Suddenly, everything was open again. For Vogel, it was liberation, though not complete. The judge ordered his release on bond, pending the state's decision on whether to retry him. After years inside prison walls, Vogel walked free. But freedom came with conditions, uncertainty, and a community that still viewed him with suspicion. The Kansas Attorney General's office now faced a brutal choice. They could appeal Sundell's ruling, hoping a higher court would reinstate the conviction. They could retry Vogel, this time without the bite mark testimony. Or they could drop the case altogether, effectively acknowledging that they had no viable evidence left. Each option carried enormous risks. Appealing might prolong the case for years, but it would also highlight the fragility of their evidence. Retrying Vogel without the pizza roll would mean building a case from almost nothing. Dropping charges could enrage the community and devastate the victim's family. As of the months following Sundell's ruling, the state had not announced its decision. Vogel remained in limbo, no longer a convicted murderer, but not fully exonerated either. For Tyler Vogel, the vacated conviction was vindication, but it came at a staggering cost. He had spent years in prison, branded a killer. His reputation, his relationships, his future, they had all been shredded by the weight of the verdict. For Robert Elmore's family, the ruling reopened wounds they thought had closed. They had believed the system had given them justice. Now they were told that the science at the heart of the conviction was unreliable. The uncertainty was unbearable. And for the community of Leavenworth, the case became a mirror. It forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the justice system. That evidence once considered solid could collapse under scrutiny. That convictions could be built on sand. Nationally, Vogel's case began to draw attention. Legal scholars, journalists, and advocates pointed to it as a stark example of the dangers of junk science in the courtroom. Bite mark analysis had long been criticized, but here was a conviction, vacated explicitly because of it. Vogel's story became part of a larger movement to purge unreliable forensics from American courts. Judge Sundell's ruling was quoted in legal briefs and academic articles. Advocates hailed it as a landmark moment, a clear statement that courts could no longer rubber stamp discredited science. And yet, the paradox lingered. Tyler Vogel walked out of prison, but he did not walk into certainty. He was free, but not cleared. Innocent in the eyes of the law until proven guilty, but still shadowed by suspicion. He lived in a kind of suspended reality, waiting for the state's next move. Would prosecutors come after him again? Would he face another trial, another jury, another fight for his life? Or would the case simply fade, unsolved and unresolved, leaving the question of who killed Robert Elmore unanswered? That was the haunting power of Judge Sundell's decision. It exposed the fragility of the system, the danger of junk science, and the devastating cost of getting it wrong. For now, Vogel's conviction was gone. His prison sentence was over. But his story, and the story of the pizza roll murder, was far from finished. Because in Kansas, the law had spoken, but justice remained elusive. The courtroom ruling in February 2024 did more than change one man's life. It cracked open a debate that goes far beyond Leavenworth, Kansas. It forced lawyers, judges, scientists, and ordinary citizens to ask themselves unsettling questions about justice, science, and the fragile line between certainty and doubt. Tyler Vogel walked out of prison after years behind bars, his conviction wiped away. But he did not walk out free in the fullest sense. He remains tethered to the legal system, bound to a process that has not yet decided his fate. And in that limbo, the questions about what happened to 71-year-old Robert Elmore, and whether the system that convicted Vogel can be trusted, still hang heavily in the air. The Kansas Attorney General's office now faces a choice, and it is a choice with no easy path forward. On paper, they have three options. They can retry Vogel for Elmore's murder, this time without the bite mark evidence that a judge has called junk science. They can drop the charges entirely, conceding that the case is simply too weak to bring to court again. Or they can appeal Judge Sundell's decision, hoping to reinstate the original conviction by convincing a higher court that the trial was fair. Each option carries its own risks, its own political costs. Retrying Vogel means admitting, implicitly, that the state's case was never as strong as it claimed to be. Without the bite mark testimony, prosecutors would need to build their narrative around whatever circumstantial evidence remains. And that evidence, by their own past framing, was never the core of their argument. Dropping the case entirely, meanwhile, would expose the state to criticism that it sent a man to prison for life on the strength of flawed science. It would force the Attorney General's office to acknowledge, in plain terms, that its forensic foundations were unsound. And appealing Judge Sundell's ruling would invite national scrutiny, drawing even more attention to a practice, bite mark analysis, that has already been discredited in the eyes of much of the scientific community. For now, the Attorney General has not announced a final decision, and so Tyler Vogel waits. His family waits. The community of Leavenworth waits. Behind every legal strategy, every press release, are human beings whose lives have been torn apart. For Tyler Vogel, the years in prison cannot be undone. However this case ends, the mark of a murder charge, a vacated conviction, and a still unresolved trial will follow him for life. Even as he walks free on bond, there is no true freedom. There is stigma. There is uncertainty. There is the looming possibility that he may be forced to stand trial again for a crime he insists he did not commit. For Vogel's family, the ordeal has been equally devastating. They have lived through the shattering moment when he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. They have endured the long, lonely years of his incarceration, and they have borne the cautious hope of his release, tempered always by the knowledge that the case is not over. Every milestone, the day he walked free, the nights he returned home, comes shadowed by the possibility that it could all be taken away again. And then there is the family of Robert Elmore. For them, this ruling is not vindication. It is not closure. It is another wound, reopening old griefs. Their loved one was killed violently, and the man the system told them was guilty is no longer a convicted murderer. They, too, are left in limbo. They are left to wonder, if Tyler Vogel didn't kill Robert Elmore, then who did? And if he did, how could the system have bungled the evidence so badly? The community of Leavenworth, too, feels this fracture. In small towns, murder cases leave scars. They divide neighborhoods. They sow distrust in law enforcement, in courts, in the very institutions meant to deliver justice. For some, Vogel's release is proof that the system works, that wrongful convictions can be overturned when judges are willing to confront flawed science. For others, it feels like a betrayal, an unraveling of the verdict they were told had been just and true. At the heart of this story is not only a man, a victim, and a community, but also a discipline, bite mark analysis, that has been exposed as deeply flawed. For decades, forensic odontology carried the aura of science. Dentists testified in courtrooms with charts, diagrams, and casts, declaring with apparent certainty that a mark on a body or on a piece of food matched the teeth of a suspect. Juries, faced with expert witnesses who spoke the language of science, often believed them. Convictions followed. But as the years passed, study after study dismantled the credibility of the field. The National Academy of Sciences warned that bite mark evidence was unreliable. The American Board of Forensic Odontology itself acknowledged its limitations. Innocence Project attorneys cataloged wrongful convictions where bite mark testimony had played a central role. The discipline that once carried the weight of certainty is now widely recognized as what Judge Sundell called it, junk science. The Vogel case, with its bizarre detail of a frozen pizza roll as the central piece of evidence, is not an outlier. It is part of a pattern, It is one more example of the dangers of leaning on forensics that promise more than they can deliver. This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Justice is fragile. A single piece of evidence, flawed but persuasive, can tip the scales. A single expert, presenting himself as objective, can sway a jury. And once a verdict is reached, undoing it requires years of appeals, motions, and legal battles. For Tyler Vogel, it took 6 years to pry open the cracks in the case against him. 6 years before a judge declared that the science that had put him away was unworthy of a courtroom. 6 years of his life spent behind bars. What does that say about the cases we never hear about? About the men and women without the legal resources, without the media attention, without the scientific scrutiny, who may be serving life sentences right now on the basis of flawed evidence. And then there is the question that hangs over all of this, the question that keeps the case alive in the minds of those who followed it. If not Tyler Vogel, then who? Robert Elmore's murder remains unsolved. There is no alternate suspect, no alternate narrative that the state has put forward. Without the bite mark testimony, the case is stripped bare, and what remains has not been enough to convince the Attorney General's office or the public that Vogel's guilt is clear. It is possible that Vogel will be retried. It is possible that prosecutors will attempt to weave a case out of the fragments that remain. It is possible, too, that the charges will be dropped, leaving the murder of Robert Elmore without a legal resolution. In either scenario, the truth about what happened in that Leavenworth home in 2018 remains elusive. For Elmore's family, this is the cruelest reality. They are left with grief that has no end point, a story with no conclusion. Their loved one was taken, and years later, they are still waiting for justice. The Tyler Vogel case has already become a reference point in broader conversations about forensic reform. Legal scholars cite it as a cautionary tale. Advocates for the wrongfully convicted point to it as proof that the system continues to rely on questionable science. It raises urgent questions for courts and legislatures. Should bite mark evidence be barred entirely from courtrooms? Should past convictions that relied on it be revisited? How do we balance the finality of verdicts with the possibility of scientific error? These are not abstract questions. They are questions with real human stakes. For every Tyler Vogel, there may be others, men and women serving sentences for crimes they did not commit, convicted on evidence now known to be unreliable. So we are left here, at the edge of a story with no true ending. Tyler Vogel is free, but not free. Robert Elmore is gone, but his killer has not been definitively named. A community is divided, a family is grieving, and a system is reckoning with the consequences of the evidence it once trusted. The pizza roll that once seemed like a bizarre footnote is, in fact, a symbol. A symbol of how fragile justice can be. A symbol of how something as small, as strange, as seemingly trivial as a frozen snack can become the hinge on which a life turns. And it is a reminder that in the search for justice, certainty is elusive. That the law can pronounce guilt or innocence, but truth is often harder to find. The story of Tyler Vogel and the so-called pizza roll murder is not over. It is still unfolding, and until it ends, it will continue to challenge us to ask the hardest questions. How do we know what we know? Who do we trust to tell us? And what happens when the answers we relied upon turn out to be wrong?